So I'm Constantine Kontokosta. I'm Associate Professor of Urban Science and Planning and Director of the Civic Analytics Program at NYU Marron Institute of Urban Management. I also direct the Urban Intelligence Lab at the NYU Center for Urban Science and Progress. And I'm joined with my fantastic research colleagues, Dr. Boyeong and Bartosz. Okay, we'll talk through today some of our work that we've been doing, show some examples of how we're using open data, how we're using different computational methods to really extract some understanding and insight out of these data sets, not only to just empower the public and residents of the city, but also to help inform city operations, city planning, and broadly public sector decision-making. The next slide, please, Bartosz. So just a quick outline for today. I'll give a little bit of an introduction to the work that we do and how we think about these types of problems. And then Bartosz will walk through our extensive work with the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice on building energy efficiency and carbon emissions from buildings. And then we'll turn it over to Bo, who will talk about our work more specifically with 311 data, particularly around understanding issues of bias and fairness in 311 data and fairness issues in terms of predictive modeling that are trained on these data. So we'll give some examples in all of these cases from some of our National Science Foundation funded work, and just give an example of kind of what it's like to work with some of these data, what are the issues, and ultimately what you can do with them. And next slide, please. This is maybe a generic pipeline here, but our work is really focused on this intersection of data science and urban science. So we're thinking about how to use all of these new large-scale urban data resources together with computational methods to get at big problems in urban planning and operation. That's really our focus. We think about bringing big interdisciplinary teams together to work on these problems. And I think a core to the work that we do at the Marron Institute is really around impact-driven work. So we work very closely with city agencies, not only from New York, but from across the country on everything and issues from ranging, like I mentioned, from energy and response to 311 complaints to waste and transportation and air quality and all kinds of other issues as well. So a really important piece of our work is working hand in hand with the city agencies to get at these problems appropriately, to bring in the right people who know and have the expertise in how to shape the problems and figure out how to bring data to hopefully solve them or address them in a more fair and an efficient way. Next slide. You missed one. So our work just broadly in the Civic Analytics program is focused on 4 different areas, 2 of which we'll touch on today. One is broadly on bias and fairness in algorithmic decision-making. And this work is funded by the National Science Foundation and a grant from Amazon as well. And we have been focusing on 311 data in New York and Kansas City, as well as cities across North America, to really look at how these data, how people report differently across different communities and different circumstances. And then ultimately how these reporting behaviors might influence resource allocation that's based on who's complaining and when. So we really wanted to unpack and understand how people report things differently and what are the basis for some of those differences. Our next work is in data for climate action. So we've been working with the city since the initial rollout of Local Law 84 back in 2010, 2011, when it was just a CSV of some buildings and their energy consumption. And we've worked with them, as you'll see, to build all kinds of really interesting tools, from visualization tools to better ways to grade the energy performance. So that's been an exciting piece of the work, really a fantastic collaboration with the city. Our work on neighborhood dynamics involves large-scale mobility data, which we will talk about in relation to some of our 311 data as well. And we're really interested in understanding how communities respond to natural disasters. What is the effect of mobility behavior, for instance, on COVID infection? How will climate impacts change migration patterns across cities and across the United States? So these are all questions that we're getting at with some of these data sets. And then lastly, we have a group of work in kind of artificial intelligence for city management. So this is where we're bringing, I think, some more sophisticated machine learning models to bear on different data sources, including open data, just to really help operational decision-making within cities. So next slide, please. So again, I think when we talk today, we're really talking about some of these data sets. The New York City Open Data is an incredible resource, and having watched it grown in terms of the number of data sets and the coverage and the comprehensiveness of the data sets that are available over the years, really has become a wonderful resource. And that resource is multiplied by knowing and understanding how to integrate these data with other data sources and other data sets that may be open data, that may be data that are a bit more proprietary in nature. But this is really, I think, where new insights can be generated in an exciting way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bartosz to talk about some of our work on building energy efficiency and climate.
Thank you, Constantine, the research scientist and lab manager at Civic Analytics program at Marron Institute for Urban Management. And I would like to present to you and give a little bit more hands-on examples working with the building energy data that Constantine already introduced that we use in some of our projects. As we all know, the climate changes are going to be the great challenge for the 21st century. The impacts of the changing weather patterns, the extreme events, they're going to impact everybody on the planet. And the cities are actually specifically endangered in a way because of the fact that majority of the global population now lives in the cities, but also where the cities are located, oftentimes along the coast. So they are all at risk to being affected by various climate change effects, from rising sea levels to urban heat islands and flooding and so on. So it's not a surprise that cities are actually are in the forefront of the fights and efforts to curb the effects of greenhouse of climate change. And in the US, currently there's more than 30 cities that implement some kind of policy that is trying to address those challenges, those problems lying ahead. And in total, there is roughly 100,000 buildings that the cities are realizing that the majority of their greenhouse gas emissions in general are coming from their built environments, or from the buildings. So they are implementing different laws to trying to, on one hand, better understand the energy consumption patterns, the emission patterns, and also look for the opportunities where to cut down the most of the emissions. So there is, in the US as of now, there's more than 30 cities implemented some kind of policy. They capture more than 100,000 buildings, which encompasses 11 billion square foot. And 30% of them are actually located in New York City. And for that matter, New York City is on the very spearheading the efforts in this domain in trying to understand and utilize the information related to building energy and building greenhouse gas emissions to efficiently counter those climate change risks. New York City implemented a greener, greater building plan that assumes reducing 80% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, which is really ambitious goal. And in order to achieve that, they introduced the series of different laws, with the first one being actually the second in the nation after Washington, D.C., which was called LL84, just trying to benchmark the energy consumption of the biggest buildings. And that's going to be the data set that we will be focusing on today. So that law was implemented in 2008, and then it was followed by a series of other by extending the policy to capture mid-sized buildings. So now it captures buildings above 25,000 square feet. And the culmination as of now was in 2019 when New York City was the first city to implement the caps on the emissions coming from the buildings. So by 2024, the buildings that are covered by this law are required to maintain their emissions below certain level, depending on the building type and their type of usage, which is really groundbreaking policy. So let me talk a little bit about this first data that was, as he started this whole effort. So as I mentioned, LL84 data, which now we have the 11th iteration because it's reported annually. It basically requires the property owners of the buildings as of now bigger than 25,000 square feet to annually report their energy and water consumption through the tool provided by Environmental Protection Agent. And the building owners are required to do it once a year. So as of 2022, we have 11 years of data starting in 2010. The most recent data set is from 2020, and it covers almost 30,000 buildings with more than 3 billion square footage. What's interesting is that this almost 30,000 buildings is only 2.6% of building stock in New York City. There's more than a million buildings in the city. However, this 2.6% covers more than 60% of the total square footage of the city. So by focusing on the biggest properties, it provides pretty good coverage for the entire building stock in terms of the square footage. So what information is included in this data set? Of course, some basic building information such as addresses, names, location, what type of building is that, what's the size of the building, but more importantly, it provides information about the energy performance of the building, energy and water performance of the building. Information such as the different fuels that are being used, total energy, performance metrics such as energy use intensity, which is the total energy divided per square feet, as well as Energy Star score information, which is like a grading program. If you are not familiar, many of the appliances are also participating in this program. And eventually the greenhouse gas emissions for each property. So let me briefly switch to the lab session to this. So I'll share with you the script. Let me know if you can see it or just okay. For the purpose of today's presentation, we created a repository where it will be publicly available after the event, where you can review the code, work with the data directly, provide you some guidance on how to use it, how it can be accessed, and what can be done with. So I preloaded some of the data here just to save some time, but let's start with accessing the data. So you can to do that, there are multiple ways, but New York City Open Data Platform is built up on Socrata, which is like the open data provider, and I guess the most popular among different cities in the US. One of the way of accessing it is to use the Socrata API client, which I'm using here. So after setting up the client, providing the dataset ID, we can easily retrieve the information provided in a programmatic way. So let's just load the records. And that's how it looks like. It's CSV and with the information, as I briefly mentioned, like property ID is the identification, BBLs, which are the tax lots in New York City, and a bunch of other information. Let's just show how big is the data. So there's, as I mentioned, there's almost 30,000 properties, 250 columns. There's a lot of columns associated because each building type has their own specific columns. In addition to those like standardized shared columns between all the property types, some of the property types have their own specific information incorporated. That's why it's pretty wide table, roughly 53 megabytes. So one thing to point out is that it's self-reported data set. That being said, it might have multiple erroneous entries, some errors, some outliers due to either just human error, some misunderstandings, some misalignment in the data reporting process. So we need to take care of that before any further analysis. So just to give you an example of some common things to be taken care of, here I'm defining the list of the columns that will be useful in this presentation. So let me just load it in. First of all, we need to remove the duplications because the property owners have two windows to report this data. Sometimes they are missing some of the information in the first reporting period. They have to report it. They are reporting the missing information later on. So there are duplications. There are multiple entries for the same properties. So we can remove the properties based on this property ID, which is the unique identifier, and using the generation date as a way to figure out which one is the most recent entry to the data. So let's do this. The second thing is the BBL identifier, as I mentioned, borrow block lot, which is the tax lot information. Again, it's free entry. People can write anything, so it's not in a standardized way. So we need to find a way to standardize it. So we'll just do simple standardization by removing some unnecessary character. Let's remove missing. Let's replace the string of not available data to actual values of NANs, which are not available that are understandable by Python. Convert into numerical values. Okay, and now we should have, and then the biggest and the most problematic way is to remove the outliers. Again, it's self-reporting data. There might be various outliers in the size of the data, in the energy consumption information. So just as an example of one way of removing outliers that we are using, we're gonna use standard deviation approach. So let's look at the EUI information, so which is the energy consumption information per square feet for the building. So that's the distribution, and we will apply the logarithmic transformation to get a more standardized standard distribution, when we can then apply removing outliers using the standard deviation. Let's see how it looks. So the distribution of raw data looks like this. So there is a lot of properties, almost all of them, very in the lower end of the distribution, with some very big outliers, which we can see here. On average, the EUI value is 137. The maximum value is almost 200,000, which is clearly not the way it's in any way realistic value. So after log transformation, the distribution of the values is more similar to standard distribution, by applying 3 standard deviation outlier detection method, we cut down extremely small and extremely big values, which ends up having the range of the values up to 700. So let's apply this, and the resulting data set is 26,000 entries. So we are losing about 1,000 properties. So let's see what kind of buildings we see there. There are 74 types of buildings, with the biggest one being multifamily housing, which is almost 18,000 properties, followed by the office building. So these are the 2 main building types. By square footage, as I mentioned, more than 3 billion square feet. Again, multifamily housing, the office buildings following. To look at this in a more appealing way, let's look at the ratios of that, right? So we can see the majority of the buildings, of the properties, are multifamily housing. However, when we look at the square footage, the office building stands out much more. That means they are, even though they're not as common, there tends to be much bigger properties. And just to finish, I would like to show you how this data can be merged with other available data sets available on New York City Open Data or other publicly available resources. Here, famous PLUTO data, which is the land use information. We can merge this local 84 data using this BBL identifier to map it with the PLUTO data, which contains, here I'm using map PLUTO, which contains the geometries of each tax lot in the city. I already preloaded it because it takes quite some time. So to save time, I'm merging the data set, simplifying the geometries just to help in the rendering process. And as I said, I keep that already open. As a result, we can use the volume plugin, which allows us to look at the locations where those buildings are located, where the properties are located, with some additional information. So there's like an interactive plugin where you can assess the energy usage in this case, where the color reflects the energy use intensity of each property. Okay, so that's just to give you some example of how this data can be accessed and utilized, and what can be done with this data now. Can you see the slides again? Okay, thanks. So first of all, some of the work that we did, as Constantine mentioned, we were helping the city administration, the mayor's office of climate and environmental justice, to get this original raw values of the spreadsheet to more digestible and publicly accessible format. So as you can see, instead of using the spreadsheet, this can be transferred into interactive visualization map, where you can click on the building and get some more specific information regarding its energy usage, emissions, water usage, try to filter based on whatever is of your interest. So that allows public easier way to get familiar with these data. By collecting this data over time, we can start to track the progress towards the goal of this 80% greenhouse gas emission reductions or effectiveness of other policies. So, for example, the fuel consumption of different source of fuels. Here is a great example. By looking at this data, we can see the phasing out of the heaviest fuels, fuel oil number 5 and 6, which is the biggest pollutant used by the buildings mostly for heating. And we can see there was a law implemented to actually reduce the use of those fuel types, and we can see with time the ratio of usage of this fuel faded out over time. We can start to look at how different building types are actually performing over time, whether there's certain groups that are performing as we expected, and by that reducing their carbon and energetic footprint. And we can see that there's some groups of properties that are actually doing the opposite, and that might be indication for the city administration to maybe target those specifically, and ultimately get to our goal of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We can also start by looking at this data. We can inform policy by trying to do some modeling to establish our city-specific grading systems. Potentially might perform better than the countrywide standards like Energy Star Score, which city actually implemented a couple of years back. Now you probably can see in the lobbies of most of the buildings that are covered by this local 84 law are required to report their grade, similar to what restaurants are required to do. We can evaluate also the other policies by combination of this data set with other available data sets. So, for example, also in 2008, city implemented local law 87, which requires those properties to undergo energy audit. And by looking at their energy performance from the benchmarking data, from this local 84 data, we can see how the properties that actually took the audit performs versus those who didn't. And in one of our study, we found that there is up to 5.7% reduction in the energy consumption in the buildings that took the audit. Other aspects, we can then similar data set, as I mentioned at the beginning, available in other cities. We can now start to compare how they perform, compare it with the demographic information to see, for example, how much the energy efficiency affects the energy cost that properties that the homeowners have to pay depending on their income, depending on their location and the infrastructure they live in. And ultimate goals on our lab, on our group, is to find a way to use all these data sources to design a hyperlocal dynamic model of urban greenhouse gas emissions, which would allow us better understanding of where the emissions are coming from, which parts of cities are the source of the highest emissions, and also how that might impact the local communities. So thank you for that, and I will let Bo take over from now. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Bartosz. Now I'm going to talk about another open data Civic application primarily based on resident service request data. So probably you're familiar with, or at least have heard about, the 311 system. And residents or citizens report non-emergency concerns or problems to the 311 system through various channels such as a phone call, text, social media, or online. People use this platform to report a bunch of different local problems, including code violations or street maintenance. So based on residents' complaints, the city government identifies near real-time local problems and did respond proactively for city service delivery or enforcement. Not just receiving resident complaints, many city governments operate on open data programs to share data from city government with the public. Data sets are available in a variety of machine-readable formats, and they are updated frequently. This helps the government be more transparent to make decisions informed by data, and it enables public participation in civic technology. So based on our research, there are more than 100 cities in North America that use the 311 system. 46 cities make 311 data open to the public through different data sharing methods, including the credit system, every open data doc, or an Excel file. 30 cities in our research sample we rely on the credit system as a 301 open data sharing system, including New York City. So we could access and create this data through open API and SQL language easily. So for example, the slide shows a total 301 service request volume in 30 different cities based on standardized technical computing structure. So there was no need to download or visit every single city's 301 data, and we just deployed a one standardized code to get this information. So let me show a hands-on another quick example. So this first example will show how to access 301 data for multiple cities to understand various volumes of resident service requests in different cities. Let me share my other screen. So here, as you can see, there is a bunch of different code here. So I've already loaded some API endpoints. So if you go to the credit system, then you can find API endpoint here. And basically, you can use this API endpoint to get all this data set. So I've already loaded this header of key, created date, and different agencies, complete type descriptors, and different information on like location things. And also you can just select columns that you just want to see. So I just picked 7 different columns here, and you can use actually different kind of SQL-like function to get, all different counts or different types of information without any downloading. Because as New York City 301 data set or even other 301 data set has really big, so we can actually store the data set in the local machine. Of course, if you have a supercomputer, that would be possible. But just using personal machine, it's actually hard to get like a full data set. But if you actually use this kind of function, you can easily get all the information very quickly. And the next example is yearly counts and monthly counts by using this data date child date function. So this one shows like yearly counts of New York City 301 data since 2010. And this is monthly 301 complaints of volume since last year, 2021. And the next goal is, counting 301 service requests for multiple cities. So as I showed before, we can get all this different cities 301 information by using Socrates' API endpoint. So I've already collected 6 different cities API endpoints here. And those 2 columns show their unique ID and also date related column information. So by using this API URLs, I created this for loop to just access the 6 different cities 301 data set very quickly in this code, we'll actually get all different volume of 301 complaints in the 6 different cities. It takes some time, but we can just move on to the next example. So after having the 6 different or 5 different cities of 301 volume, of course, we can use, based on this table, result table, then we can basically create bar charts to show difference of the volume in terms of 301 reports. And by using this kind of logic, we could access those 30 different cities very easily to get this kind of bar chart to compare their total volume and also per capita volume. And I've seen a question in the chat box. So we will actually share our GitHub repo after this session. So you can get all our script and all the information through this GitHub repo. So going back to the slide. So let's dig into a little bit more about New York City 301, which is the largest 301 operation in the world. So New York City 301 was implemented in 2003, and there have been approximately 28 million service requests reported since 2010. Top 4 complete types are noise, heat and hot water outage, illegal parking, and street condition problem. And we've worked on multiple different analytics projects based on 301 datasets. So one of the recent interesting projects is understanding pre- and post-pandemic complaint patterns and people's reporting behaviors. Overall, there have been 17% less complaints reported during the pandemic and compared to 2019 year. And you can see here in this graph that shows an overall decrease in complaint volume right after the stay-at-home order. And you can probably notice a change in this graph after stay-at-home order around March 20 in 2020. On March 28, 2020, new complaint types were added to the New York City 301 system: social distancing and face covering. We cannot see this pink area here in the 2019 data, but suddenly the social distancing complaints appeared, which is one of the top 3 complaint types, followed by noise and building issues during the early stage of the pandemic. So over the 3-month period from the end of March through early July, a total of 71,000 social distancing complaints were reported, which is equivalent to 480 daily complaints on average. So this suggests a significant level of social distancing concern among New York City residents. The 301 social distancing complaints can be also accessed easily through Open API. So let's take a look at how to plot how many social distancing complaints have been reported. So going back to the super notebook, we can just set kind of time frame of 2019 March through June and 2020 March through June. So we can compare different volume between 2 years. So we can see approximately 17% decrease in New York City total complaints. And then we set our study period from like February through August last year to see all different social distancing related complaints and different types of complaints. So this is the whole complaints between those 2 periods. And then I use people table to create those top 50 most reported complaint types from February 1st through August 8th. So we can see all different types of like policy implications here. So March 20th, we see the shelter in place stay-at-home order. And we also can see phase 1, 2, 3, and 4 opening after the summer. And the same thing, but we can also use a proportion, right? So the same logic, this plot shows like 0 to 100% of static plot of this proportion of different types of complaints in the city. So we can see after March 20th stay-at-home order, like there is some kind of big change in terms of different types of complaints reported from residents. And then, next goal is understanding social distancing complaints. So this is like specify the descriptor, which is the detailed version of the complaint types. So we use social distancing and face covering, just filter this data. So this data set has all different types of social distancing related complaints, but there are just 2 types. The total count says 75,000 total. And the minimum date that reported is 2020 March 28th, the first day of the social distancing complaint. And the last one is 2022 this year, February 16th. And then by using a similar SQL-like data to truncate daily level social distancing volume, complaint volume, you can get this daily level of social distancing complaints throughout the study period from March 28th through August 2020. As you can see here, there's like a big kind of drop right after phase 3 reopening. This is because the city government actually used different policy implementation after this phase 3 reopening to handle social distancing related violations. Let me go back to the slide again. So it's overstep, this real-world data enhance civic analytics and evidence-based decision-making process. But there is a significant limitation. We know that people do not report their problems to the real-world system at the same level. Some people are more sensitive to perceive a local problem, while others care less about the same issue. Or some people might have limited access to the real-world system despite facing problems. So this links to a data bias issue, right? Under or overrepresentation of local problems. So this is not just a data bias issue. This could result in an inequity issue or ineffective city service location if a city government solely relies on real data to identify local problems. So for this, we are interested in understanding the imperatives and real reporting, specifically focusing on social distancing bias sensitivity during the COVID-19 pandemic. We propose a social distancing sensitivity score based on psychophysics theory as shown in the slide. So I'll not go into every detail, but there are two main concepts. So first, we use an absolute threshold, which is a minimum intensity that results in the perception of a stimulus. And the second concept, a difference threshold is defined as a minimum increase in intensity of an external stimulus required to result in perception of a change in its intensity. So we use University 301 social distancing data, of course, together with point of interest foot traffic data for establishments in the city provided by SafeGraph. So we quantify the absolute activity intensity for each establishment by calculating the number of visits per square foot for 6-hour time windows over the study period. So the difference threshold for each establishment is quantified by estimating a percent difference between typical POI visit density, when no complaint is reported, and POI visit density when a complaint is reported. So basically, those two measures are used to calculate social distancing sensitivity score. So in this case, this means perceive changes in crowding above the residents' comfort level for appropriate and safe social distancing behavior. So as you can see here, we got an establishment level social distancing sensitivity score across the city, and this can be used for neighborhood level aggregate measure. So there are clear spatial patterns that have occurred in New York City neighborhood social distancing compliance sensitivity. So we can find that sensitivity to non-compliance with social distancing guidelines is lower in minority and low-income neighborhood. Also, the population density in low sensitivity neighborhood is less than half of the most sensitive neighborhood, which suggests that density increases concerns about overcrowding. Also, we found that political differences are also very significantly associated with social distancing sensitivity. So we picked two example neighborhood here, the Bensonhurst and Park Slope in Brooklyn as a case study. In Park Slope, neighborhood with more unemployed white, higher income household and voters who voted for President Joe Biden, a social distancing complaint is reported when observed overcrowding is 23% more than normal period. On the other hand, the Bensonhurst community, a lower income and working class community with more than 97% voted selected a Republican candidate. A social distancing complaint is only reported if the POI visit density exceeds almost 4% more than normal period. So basically what we found is that they're clear disparities in reporting social distancing violations. So more significantly in the public health, potential bias in reporting behaviors can lead to increased health risks for underreporting neighborhood. In fact, social distancing sensitivity score is highly associated with other measures of public health outcomes and risks, as this graph shows. So that being said, current systems, when implicit or explicit biases are unaddressed, it will reinforce existing inequities and challenges in vulnerable neighborhoods. Lastly, I'd like to mention that our interactive visualization tool is currently under development to disseminate our findings and insights based on open data civic analytics. So hopefully it will be shared with you all pretty soon. But thank you for listening, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Bo and Bartosz. That was great. And there was a question earlier about sharing the code, and we will make that code available to the folks who are on the join the meeting here. But happy to answer any questions you all have.
But there is one question. What is the visualization tool called?
Which one?
You can talk about Bartosz, right? Yeah, you can talk about.
Yeah. So one is the energy map. Oh, the last one under development.
Okay, so this one is based on the Esri story map currently. Yeah. So we use a bunch of different spatial data and our results. So we put merge and integrate all the data sets to show the kind of the whole storytelling and also effective kind of visualization based on geographical kind of information.
The previous was the New York City energy map, building energy map that's publicly available at. I'll put the URL into the chat box so you can review it as well.
And there was another question that can you track resolution time with real data? So it's hard to track like very specific time frame of the process, but there is definitely two different columns, like creative date, which is like reporting date, and there is a close date, which is official kind of closing date from the city government. So we can track that kind of period between creative date and the close date. So for example, if one resident report before heat and hot water outage at the building, and they probably have some like response from HPD or other city government, and the data set will be updated based on that close date. So you assume like that like time period between those two columns is the length of the day to fix that problem.
Thank people for the presentations. Could you talk a little about how you might imagine policymakers would use the social justice sensitivity index or tool?
Sure, I could jump in on that. And I think this, as Bo mentioned, and this gets to our broader work around understanding kind of disparities and how people are using 311. First and foremost is just thinking about enforcement. So if the intention was somewhat to have people report social distancing non-compliance and then send out or respond in some way. So obviously understanding how sensitive different neighborhoods are to these types of issues is going to influence where calls are coming from and then ultimately where resources are sent. So hopefully this is one way to begin to adjust how resource allocation decisions are made. The other is we're starting to see in our work on the sensitivity to social distancing behavior. So how many people have to really be crowded around before someone's going to actually pick up the phone or email or text through a complaint is related to a lot of other health behaviors. So we're seeing this tied to infection risk. We're seeing this tied to vaccination rate uptake. So this could be one leading indicator to some degree of perhaps different communities' response to other health interventions, and helps us understand other factors relating to what I think public agencies are able to do to help stop the spread and kind of help address some of these pandemics or some of these kind of risks going forward.
And Mark, thank you for sharing this visualization tool from London about greenhouse gas emissions. Really interesting, and definitely we'll take a look into that.
All right, there are 2 minutes left, but yeah, we're happy to answer any kind of questions if you have.
Or we could just call it an afternoon as well if there's no other questions. So up to you, Zachary, how you want to handle the last minute or two here.
I think certainly if anyone has any further questions, feel free to take yourselves off mute or put it in the chat. It seems like we may have exhausted that poll. But again, thank you everyone for joining us. And thank you so much to our presenters, and hope to see you at some of the other Open Data events this weekend, and hope you could check out some of the events we had earlier in the week. And there's another question from Mark that just came in, but I'll put a link to the Open Data Week website and also address Mark's question.
For the data quality, so we use Pandas, Python, NumPy, the standard libraries, if that's what you ask. But then again, I mean the data cleaning procedures, in my opinion, depends a lot in what the research question is, or what the question in general what you're trying to answer. And in an example, I just dropped the outliers, but that might not be the best approach for your purposes. Also, the outlier identification might be very different. You might be a little bit more inclusive or exclusive or strict with it. So here it was just as an example, one method to do it, but clearly it's not exhaustive, and there might be better options depending on the need.
With that, thank you all again for attending, and hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.